My name's Brian Holt. This talk has had like 17 different names, so I apologize if this is not the one that you remember. What's coming after ES6, JavaScript proposals, TC39, you can call it whatever you want. Which, Bruce is right, they are truly harrowing meetings. That they are really long and people like to argue. Okay, so I work for this little startup called LinkedIn, which is owned by an even tinier startup called Microsoft. I've been there for like 4 months. Yeah, go Microsoft. Yeah, it's been fun. I work on the learning product, which is, many of you may know as Lynda, but now it's LinkedIn Learning. I do a little thing called Frontend Happy Hour. It's where I get really drunk and talk about JavaScript. It's a podcast. That's the whole premise of it, is getting drunk and JavaScript. So if you want to share in that experience, I invite you to. I also do a little thing called Frontend Masters, which has been a lot of fun. We teach videos, which is something that Richard has done. It's something that Sarah Drasner has done. It's pretty cool. I'm probably more well known for my time at Netflix. I was there for a couple years. Little known fact is I actually worked on the Hebrew version of Netflix, so you're welcome. Which surprisingly was not as difficult as I was anticipating, because it was our second right-to-left language after Arabic, and thanks to a lot of the technologies that Jing talked about, it didn't really require too much rewriting, so browsers are really cool. I also worked at this little startup, which actually at the time was a little startup. By show of hands, how many of you actually use Reddit? How many of you are just like not raising your hands and still you actually use Reddit, like way too much? Okay. I like to joke that my first 2 companies that I worked at were all about wasting your time, and now the current company I work at is about like actually being productive with your time. So I'm from Utah originally. I currently live in San Francisco, and I lived in Torino for a couple of years. I'm a big Juventus fan. I think I heard some boos in there, and I'm just going to ignore that. And this is my puppy. This is what I like to call paying the puppy tax. So if you don't remember anything else, I have a cute puppy. That's a real dog. It's not a stuffed animal. People do ask me that. Okay. So on to maybe less exciting things than puppies. So how does JavaScript evolve? So the point, the premise of this talk is for you to understand kind of like how the sausage is made, right? Like pulling the curtain behind the curtain and seeing how proposals make it into JavaScript, why they make it into JavaScript, because it's kind of a, as Bruce was alluding to, kind of like this nefarious organization says, and now we bless you with these new features, right? It's kind of a top-down dictation, or it can feel like that sometime. And sometimes we have favorite features that don't make it in. We have other features like, why is this making it in? I don't understand about it. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about this so it doesn't feel so nefarious, to use my previous term. So TC39. This is actually the name of the committee that standardizes JavaScript. Now, that really seems like kind of an arbitrary name, Technical Committee 39, right? What happened to Technical Committee 38, right? Or 37, or 5, or any of the others? It's just because. No, I'm just kidding. There are 38 other committees. There are more than that now. It's because it's through a body called ECMA, which formerly used to mean European Computer Manufacturer Association, which is incorrect in my slide. About 5 years ago, they decided to just drop the acronym. So it used to be an acronym. It is no longer an acronym. And now it's actually just ECMA, which to me, at that point, they should have said to themselves, let's have a better name, right? Instead they're like, no, we're doubling down on this ECMA thing. This is a good idea. Now we're just literally ECMA. So whatever. I think we're engineers. We're not branding experts, I suppose. So that's what it is now. ECMA hosts a lot of standardization committees. For example, they standardize C#. They standardize Dart now. They have a couple committees. There's also some like more highly technical engineering standardizations that they maintain as well. So TC39 is one of the at least 39 committees that ECMA houses. There's a document called ECMA 262, which is actually the document that defines the ECMAScript language. So I think I will get on to what the difference is in ECMA. I think it's actually on my next slide. Yeah. So you might have heard this term ECMAScript before, and it's kind of confusing because it's used sort of interchangeably with JavaScript, and that's because in all practicality, it's kind of interchangeable with JavaScript. Technically, ECMAScript is the name of the standard, right? And JavaScript is the implementation of the standard. Now, that's not really a useful distinction to make because, as far as I know, there are no other implementations besides JavaScript. So it's kind of ends up being interchangeable, but they are semantically different things. Okay, so let's talk about the terms ES3, ES5, what happened to ES4, like that sort of thing. They're not doing what I like to call the Microsoft numbering system, where they just decide, like, yeah, we don't want Windows 9, we're going to go straight to 10. Or I guess Apple's like, no, we don't like 9 either. I guess we're just going to go to the iPhone 10. So we didn't quite do that with JavaScript, but we did not end up with an ES4. We ended up with just ES3, ES5, ES6, and then we skipped a whole lot of numbers and went to ES 2016. So we're real good at counting. So these are major revisions of the language in the sense that, like, we had ES3, and then we went to ES5, and we brought in a whole bunch of new features. And so with every revision here, they were just incrementing that number, almost like a semantic versioning. With ES6, they decided we should not go like 7 years between specifications. This is kind of ridiculous. So rather than bump a major version every 7 years, what we're going to do is we're going to have kind of what they call the train model, right? Where, let's see. Nope, we'll go back. So they moved to a yearly release cycle that features get added by going through these stages, which we'll talk about here in a second. And if you're on the train come March, then that gets added to ES 2016, ES 2017, 2018. And if it doesn't make it, then it can make it next year. And so that train is constantly departing every single year. And so if those features make it in, then they get added in. And then they move to the nomenclature of ES 2016, ES 2017 to denote that, like, this is happening every year. So for example, ES 2016 was really, really small. It was the exponent operator and array.includes, and that was it. The reason being is that ES 2015, ES6 was huge. It was one of the biggest revisions of JavaScript ever. So I think we all just kind of took a breather. It's like, let's deal with all this crazy stuff that we got, and then we can, revisit with 2017, which actually ended up with quite a few features. And we'll talk about ES4 here in just a second. So yeah, features are now added in stages, which we'll also address. So ES3. I was not a JavaScript developer when ES3 happened. In fact, I think I was still in junior high. So that's probably showing my age or lack thereof. We got things like regular expressions, which I can't imagine trying to solve a regular expression problem without regular expressions. We got a bunch of string methods. We got try catch. That all came with ES3. And a bunch of other stuff. I'm just kind of giving the highlights. ES5, we got the JSON object, because the JSON was kind of introduced during that time frame. And we also got getters and setters. Strict mode, which was kind of a failure, depending on who you ask. As well as we got some things like reflection. So what happened to ES4? What is ES4? So after ES3, people came together and said, let's add all this really cool stuff to JavaScript. We kind of had this opportunity to add a bunch of cool stuff. And unfortunately, no one could really agree on anything. But here are a bunch of things that were going to end up in ES4. Classes, modules, types were going to be added, generators, iterators, destructuring, and also the kitchen sink. So pretty much everything. And what's funny about everything, besides maybe the bottom two, those all made it into ES6, right? So we have eventually got those. Besides data types, we didn't really get those. We'll never get those. Use Elm if you want that. But there's things that like Mozilla was really into that Microsoft didn't want to add. There was things that Microsoft wanted to add that Mozilla didn't want to add. And so we kind of had this infighting, and they basically got to a standoff where they said, we cannot agree what's going to go into ES4. So they came back and they went into this proposal called the Harmony Proposal, which eventually ended up being, let's cut back, let's add the bare minimum that we can agree on, and we'll call it ES5. So let's talk about where I say the JSX lol part. They tried to add this specification, they being Mozilla, called E4X, which was basically JSX before it was really a thing. This actually worked in Firefox until 2014. So this was actually in Firefox for a long time. It was adding XML as a basic primitive data type to JavaScript. I mean, that looks pretty familiar, at least it does to me. It feels like writing React a little bit. And yeah, that worked just until recently. So yeah, it was standardized by Mozilla, but they eventually said, okay, fine, we're not going to win this battle, and they took it out. So what makes it into JavaScript? I think this is probably one of the more key takeaways to understand how JavaScript is standardized, why things get in, why other things don't get in. So let's kind of go down the hierarchy here. The first thing that they want to add into the JavaScript is they want to add in primitives and methodologies that enables new types of programming that you could not accomplish otherwise. And a great example of that was generators that we got in ES6, which are kind of they're not super easy to understand, but there are certain types of programming that you simply cannot do if you don't have a primitive like generators. And that's why they were a really good candidate to be added into JavaScript, is because we simply could not accomplish some things without them. The second thing is extremely common patterns, think promises, that could interop with other features if added, right? So a problem particularly with promises can be implemented with pure JavaScript, and they were. We had things like Bluebird, we had things like Q, and jQuery deferreds, which were frustratingly very similar to promises, but not quite. Anyone that knows what I'm talking about knows what I'm talking about. But if things like promises were directly a part of the browser, that means browser APIs could directly use them. And a great example of that is fetch, right? Because promises are built into the browser, that enables APIs like fetch that we can have, call out to an API and get a promise back. The browser cannot rely on the developer including Bluebird, right? So that's why things like promises make it into languages, because it makes things easier to interoperate with each other. They're useful primitives. Another thing, there's such common patterns like JSON.parse. JSON.parse is pretty computationally intensive, and trying to do that in JavaScript in userland ends up being really slow and a big package. So things like that end up making it into the language or into the browser, because that can happen in like C++ land, go a lot faster, and we parse JavaScript or JSON all the time, so it ends up being really useful. If it doesn't meet one of these first three criteria, there's a really, really good chance that it's not going to be added to JavaScript. This is not totally true. We ended up with things like arrow functions, right, which didn't really enable anything like that, but they were just convenient. So they're not always really the case, but typically these are the three things that you're going to see where we're going to make it into JavaScript. So I wanted to run through what the 4 stages of making it into JavaScript mean. Stage 0 is the newest thing being introduced, and stage 4 is made it into the language. And so let's talk about what goes in between. Stage 0 is called a Strawman Proposal, and anyone can do it. Literally, you can open up your laptop right now and just I'm going to propose method not found so I can make Rails in JavaScript. Don't. Seriously, don't. But you could do that right now if you wanted to. So anyone can propose a feature to be added to JavaScript. However, to make it to stage 1, someone on TC39 has to say I think that's a good idea, I'm going to champion it. So only a member of TC39 can champion something on to make it to stage 1. And I'm going to say most things that get proposed, probably not surprisingly to most of you, it doesn't actually make it into stage 1. It's not that these things aren't necessarily even good ideas, but, excuse me, I'm going to grab some water. It's not that they're not necessarily good ideas. It's just that they have very limited bandwidth, and browser vendors are already really busy still covering ES6, right? We don't even have all of our ES6 features yet, so they can't also take on new features as well. So we're bandwidth constrained, not necessarily idea constrained. So once it makes it to stage 1, it's considered a proposal. Someone in TC39 has said this is a good idea, I'm going to take it up. At this point, they expect you to have like a high-level API, right? They expect you to have like examples like, it should look like this, I think it should act like that. But at this point, their intentionally is still a little bit nebulous and vague because it still has to be hammered out. They want the whole committee to have input into it. They don't expect you to have all the answers up front. So it's still expected to change pretty majorly before you and I get to start using it. So it's definitely not a guarantee that's going to make it into a JS. Sometimes Babel proposals will be made, or Babel plugins will be made for proposals, but that's not always the case, especially since it's expected to change a whole lot. So let's talk about stage 2. At this point, it's a draft. Oh, and the other thing about stage 1, there's no guarantee it's going to make it into JavaScript. A lot of things still drop off at this point because one TC39 member thinks it's a good idea, but believe me, those people like to argue a lot, and a lot of things get dropped at this point. So at stage 2, it's a draft. It needs an online document at this point that kind of covers most of the use cases. So they're kind of starting to develop the spec at this point. They're expected to have a Babel plugin at this point. But the key thing about stage 2 is, one, it's probably going to make it in the language at this point. It's looking really good. And at stage 2, every other proposal will be considered in the light of this has to interoperate with stage 2. So at stage 2, they start planning other features around whatever particular proposal we're talking about. So incremental changes are expected, but nothing revolutionary. And now it's far more likely to make it. So at stage 3, it's a candidate. The spec has to be totally exhaustive of every potential use case, every potential edge case. If you've ever read one of these proposals, they're really dry and not very entertaining and don't have pictures, so I don't read them. Little to no changes are expected. Only the real changes are going to be coming from the browser vendors themselves, saying like, I tried to do this and it didn't work super well for me, so I think we need to change it to be like this. At this point, it's almost guaranteed. And I'll give you an example of why it's not totally guaranteed, but it's almost guaranteed at this point. Stage 4, it is finished. Once something is in stage 4, it will be on the next train to be ES 2016, ES 2017, blah, blah, blah. And once something moves from stage 3 to stage 4, it must be implemented by 2 browsers, whether that's behind a flag or not. But basically, they want 2 companies like Microsoft and Mozilla to say, yeah, this is good, this can be implemented, and they'll call it good at that point. No changes at this point. Once it's stage 4, it's set in stone, and it won't change. And like I'm not being dramatic about that. It literally will not change because at that point you're considered breaking the web if you change anything that's stage 4. So yeah, the new version of ES20XX ships every March. At this point, it's not really useful to know which feature made it into ES 2016 or 2017. It's just kind of a denotation that like this is officially part of the language, so you don't really have to care what's ES 2017. If you miss the deadline, you have to wait until next March. That's just the way it is. And the spec is finalized in July of every year. So here's what we got with ES 2017. We got object.entries and object.values. We got async await, which I am very, very excited about. String pad start and pad ends, so we don't end up with left pad issues anymore. Get on property descriptors, trailing commas and params, which actually I'm really happy about because it makes your get blame looks a little bit nicer. And some more shared memory atomics particularly for WebAssembly. All right, so how many of you remember this project? The font probably looks familiar to you, right? It looks a lot like that, strangely. This was probably the most revolutionary project in recent memory in JavaScript. And I'm going to actually even assert that Babel 6 was the most important thing in recent JavaScript history. Mic drop. Do you like my emoji mic drop? I was going to drop my mic, but this is hard to drop, so. Babel 5, for those of you that do or do not remember, you did not have to configure it at all. It just kind of worked out of the box. It was really convenient to spin up a brand new project and say, cool, Babel 5, just run everything through whatever you want to do with it, and it just kind of worked for you. With Babel 6, they introduced the plugin system. They said nothing works by default. You have to configure it. They brought in the Babel RC stuff, and you had to have much more intimate knowledge of how Babel worked. And there was almost open revolt at this point. People were very, very upset about this. And I know a lot of you are having a hard time fathoming what an upset JavaScript developer looks like. Just kidding. No, we're always upset about something. I don't know what it is, right? But Babel 6 ended up being super, super important because it kind of democratized the future of JavaScript. Whereas before, when they were doing ES3 and ES4 and all these things, you and I didn't have much of a choice. It was, Mozilla and Microsoft and Netscape that were in their ivory tower looking down. It's like, and now you get regular expressions, right? And we didn't get really any input on that. And that kind of sucked. But with Babel 6, they put the power back in our hands that you and I can write future JavaScript today. We can give them feedback of what you're doing doesn't work for us, fix it this way, right? And they get real usage out of this. So that's why, to me, Babel 6, despite how controversial it was extremely important to us. And you should probably all tweet at Babel and let them know how grateful you are, because that team works super hard and they're super unappreciated. So at this point, I am going to just talk about proposals that I'm really excited about and hopefully get you excited about what's coming in JavaScript. Object rest and spread, which this one's a stage 3. So I imagine most of you have seen the ... syntax with capturing the rest of parameters or spreading an array over another array. It made for some really cool patterns, and it didn't really make sense. Well, we can do this with arrays, why can't we do it with objects? And so they agreed with us and they gave us this. So you can see there, you have the ... z, which is basically capturing the rest of everything that I didn't already explicitly destructure out. So in that case, you'll get the A and B in a separate object, captured as a rest object. And then by the same thing, you'll get the spread that you can say hey, take this Z object and spread it over the rest. So it's kind of a way of doing an object merge or concat or whatever you want to call it. So that's definitely coming. Things are looking really good. Looking out for it. I already use it. So, and again, here's my personal advice to you. If you really want to use something like anything I'm showing you today, if it's stage 3, you're pretty good to just start using it, and I would feel okay about that. Stage 2, if you really want to and you're okay with a little bit of refactoring, then cool, go for it. But if stage 1 or underneath, it's the bleeding edge, right? And as the adage goes, you're the one bleeding on the bleeding edge. So definitely don't ever use stage 0. Rarely use stage 1. Actually, you know what? Just don't use stage 1. Just kidding. Stage 3, you're good though. Okay. So regular expressions improvements. This is either very exciting to you or you don't give a shit. I fall into kind of both camps. Maybe the scared camp. All this stuff scares me. So you get look behind, which is something that's been just painfully obvious that JavaScript doesn't have in regular expressions. Named capture groups, better Unicode support, which is probably actually going to be very important for Hebrew developers. You're going to be able to match things like only Hebrew characters, which I think will be really cool for you. And there's also an S flag, which will make the period character actually match every character. Right now, the period character without the S flag misses a bunch of characters just kind of by happenstance. So, surprise. Dynamic modules. Some of you probably have already seen this if you've done things like code splitting. This is actually technically stage 3, but they're just making sure that it fits with everything. This used to be called a require.ensure. That's what Webpack called it, so that's what people called it for a long time, but the actual name of it is import. The import function, it's going to be great. It's going to be useful in situations beyond just code splitting. You can also do like dynamic requiring of modules, which you probably have problems if you're trying to do that, but it's cool anyway. Global, this is nice. How many of you have written that expression before? Global object equals window or global, right? Next time you're going to be able to just say global, and global will actually start working in the browser pretty soon as well. Or at least it's spec to. We'll see if it actually works that way. And it's not just, this will work in Node, this will work in JavaScript, like IoT, it'll work in anything that implements the JavaScript specification. So that's pretty cool. New async capabilities. We're going to get async iterator, which is really exciting. I actually have a slide so that's what async iterator looks like. So you can do read line, and you can just do it line by line as it comes through. That's going to be really exciting. The reason why that's exciting is right now for just iterators, you have to know if something is done at the time that you call next, and that doesn't work for things like file I/O and reading from WebSockets and things like that. Observable is stage 1. It's been stage 1 forever. Any RxJS fans out there? All right, all right. How many of you that are scared by observables? It's this guy. No, I read a lot of them at Netflix. It was a lot of fun, but they're also kind of complicated. It's been stuck at stage 1 for a long time, and the reason why is they're trying to get it right. Everyone I've talked to on TC39 is like, this is going to land. It's going to land sometime, but they really want to nail the API because they don't want to mess it up, which I applaud their caution, because we're going to end up with more things like with if they don't do that. Okay. So promised prototype.finally. This is stage 3. This is coming as well. The really key there is on line number 11, where you can just say like, hey, whether I had an error or not, just do these things to kind of clean up. That's really cool. New class semantics. This is really dumb, but the one that I am most excited about is public class fields. If anyone writes React, they might understand why. Private fields and decorators. So let's talk about class properties. So if you're writing current React, the one on the left might look familiar. We have to make a constructor. You have to call the super method, and then you get to set your state there in the constructor. Afterwards, you're going to be able to just set the state just directly on the class definition right there, and that's going to be awesome. Private class properties. I'm not super sold on these, but maybe you are. If you're a library author, this is really where it came from. If you put that hash in there, it's truly private. It can only be accessed inside of the method, and you can have private methods as well. Library authors requested this because people were messing with the internals, and they don't like that, and then people depend on it, and then they feel like they have to support it. And I'm kind of more into like the Python mentality of like be an adult, right? Like if you want to mess with it, then yeah, go for it, but you're going to be screwed when I update it, right? So whatever, it's fine. I'm not upset. Decorators. These are fun. If you've ever written any amount of Python, it's kind of cool. If you've used the Redux connector before, React Redux connector, you know you have to like call a function, which then calls another function, right? The reason why they did that is because it's actually the perfect API for it to be a decorator. So whenever decorators land and they don't have to change anything, it just works. So that's what it's going to look like when you connect things in the future. You could do like @auth, like it's an only component that shows when it's auth. Like there's a bunch of cool stuff you could do with decorators. International segmenter. This one, you didn't know you were going to learn so much about fonts at this conference. Thanks, Gene. That was actually an awesome presentation. So I actually worked a lot on internationalization at Netflix, and it's kind of a huge problem when you have to break things down into graphemes, which is a great word that means like a single character. So let's look at my examples there. Like I have the first one, which is just like Latin characters. It's stuff I understand, right? That if I hit right on my keyboard, it's going to skip over the I, then the O, then the space, right? It's very easy to separate those into individual characters. However, if you look beneath that, that's Thai. I also had to do that at Netflix and implement it. tie characters combine with each other, right? So like, for example, that first character has like the lower character and that upper character, but if I hit right on my keyboard, that's a single grapheme, right? So if I hit right on my keyboard, I don't want it to go in the middle of the character. That doesn't make any sense, right? It needs to skip the entire character, so that it has to skip an entire grapheme. So things like Atom have to roll this on their own in JavaScript land, which is really slow, as you might imagine. So, and then look down there, you have the rockstar lady emoji. Actually, what do you think the answer to this question is? Just hold up your hand with how many characters you think that is, like the number. No one is close. It's 7. Don't believe me? Open up your browser and look right now. I'll wait. I'll wait. Just kidding, I'll show you what it is. It's these characters. It is woman's head, which is 2 characters. It is the skin tone, that's 2 characters. It is a 0 space join character. And then it is a microphone emoji, which is also 2 characters. So if you really want to, put that thing in, put document.write in that particular string right there, and you'll see that it'll write the rockstar lady with light skin tone, or darker skin tone. I can't tell with these lights. Into the browser. Unicode is fascinating. Like, just go read it like how Unicode works. It's actually really quite ingenious. So anyway, back to International Segmenter. This will actually skip over graphemes for you. It'll give you correct lengths. It does a bunch of this stuff for you, and it's really cool. Generator functions. Right now we don't have generator arrow functions. Those are coming. Function.sent. I'm not going to give you too long of this one because it's not actually as exciting as I want it to be. But function.sent on line 2, if you don't have that function.sent, that's the first thing that you provide to a generator. If you don't have function.sent, you have no way to get the first thing. So if you look down there, I'm console logging what's being yielded. You actually wouldn't see red. So that's an interesting one. That's the first one that's coming as well. Generator arrow functions, they're coming. It's just they wanted to get the semantics of generators right first. Optional chaining, this one's fun. I used to write Groovy at Netflix, which I'm very happy I don't have to write that anymore. I think they were talking about using Groovy. Sorry if I'm offending anyone. But what's really nice about the question mark, the optional chaining, is basically saying, hey, if name doesn't exist, don't error out. Just give me back null or undefined or something like that. So if I had like user.name.first character or something like that that didn't exist, it would just give me back undefined, which is cool. Relative time format, how many of you have used moment? Okay, you don't have to include moment anymore. The browser will start doing it for you. So we'll have things like, tell me what happened yesterday, right? I know, right? Such a big library. It's phenomenal what it does, and it obviously needs that much, but relative time format is coming, and it's internationalized as well, so it'll come with all the various languages. Do expressions. So this will be, you can put do expressions into places where you can use expressions at all, but you can do things like more complex, like block statement stuff. That'll be really great. Flatten, the functional operator is now stage 2. So you'll be able to have that and not have to include something like Lodash just to do that, as well as flat map is coming as well. That's also stage 2. The pipeline operator, this one's actually one of the ones I'm more excited about. So I have a font that combines ligatures, right? Again, you're going to learn way too much about fonts today. So that like play-looking logo is actually the bar angle bracket, but my font combines them together. So anyway, look at that top line on line 1. That all should make sense to you. It calls double say, and then it feeds that into capitalize, and it feeds that into exclaim. If you look down on line 4, you can actually do that. It means the exact same thing. It's like, okay, take the string hello, feed that into double say, take the result, feed that into capitalize, take the result of that, and feed that into exclaim. So we're going to get some even more functional patterns, which is going to be really, really fun to do. Partial application, currying, whatever you want to call it. This is also coming as well. So if you look down there at line 3, we have divide, and then I put the question mark in 5. So it's basically saying, give me back a new function that only has one parameter, and I feed that parameter in. It's going to plug it into the first place, and then it's going to plug 5 into the second place. And then you can see down there that you can combine that with a pipeline operator to get really, really powerful functional applications. Stage 0. There'd be dragons here, so this is the one that you don't get to use. I'm going to tell you, if you promise, no one's going to listen to me, whatever. Function expression decorators, this is one proposed by the Angular team. It's pretty cool. So you can have like, hey, I have this function here, but I want you to just go ahead and memoize that, so every time I call it, I don't have to keep going back and reevaluating it. You're going to have things like, hey, if this test takes more than 5,000 seconds, then just time out and fail the test. You're going to get these decorators that kind of apply these, higher level abilities to functions, which are going to be really cool. Parameter decorators, I'm not super sold on these ones yet, but basically like you'll have that like last refresh time that's going to say invoke this function and inject that parameter here. You really could just call it on the first line of the function, but someone's really excited about that. So we're going to get a URL object, hopefully, so that we don't have to import some sort of like query string library or anything like that. It'll just be built into the browser. That'll be really great. Pattern matching, if you ever use like Haskell or guards or things like that, this will be exciting. You can say, if the object looks like this, then do this. If the object looks like that, then do that. If, this could also be really useful for Redux, for writing your root reducers and things like that. Dead proposals, they do die sometimes. Object.observe, terrible idea. Everyone's happy it's dead. Just kidding. No, it's just a really bad, it was going to lead to some bad patterns. SIMD, single instruction multi-data, I think. It was a concurrency model for JavaScript. They eventually said, you know what, this is a really great proposal, but WebAssembly is going to take over this. Let's keep JavaScript really simple and single-threaded. Let's take all the multi-threaded goodness and throw it in, and throw that behind WebAssembly. So that's why SIMD went away. So you're going to ask me, Brian, how do I help? And here's kind of my 101 on how to help JavaScript the language. TC39 is aware that they still kind of feel like old men in an ivory tower, and they're trying to kind of fix that and get more involvement from the community. But today, here's what you can do. Just use new stuff. Like go make awesome code pens, post them, share them with the world and say, check out how I use this new function in this cool way, or I use this and it broke, and I think we should change this. That's a really, really good thing to do, and just tweet and talk about it. I got almost all of my information from the TC39 GitHub repo, so I would suggest checking that out. There's a lot of activity on it, so I would say follow it, but just be prepared to see a lot of stuff. But definitely just keep an eye on it. Go in and propose your ideas. It's not something I've done, but if you have some awesome thing from the language that you're writing that you think would be really great in JavaScript, then go ahead and propose that, talk to people. And I'm just going to throw out like a big shout out for the last one, contribute to Babel. There's so much stuff to be done with Babel. New plugins to be written, documentation to be written, just like working on the transpiler. Like I'm not a compiler person, and Babel is still fairly approachable if you want to spend the time to do it. So I would definitely suggest all of those things. Today, a lot of people use Babel Preset ES 2015. Like they just kind of do that by default. Stop. Stop doing that. In fact, it's deprecated now. What they want you to use now is what's called Babel Preset Em, where you just kind of say, hey, make this work for the last 3 major browser versions, and it'll make it work for Chrome 62, 61, and 60. And it'll transpile everything that needs to be transpiled for that and not transpile anything else. This is helpful because this moves with you. So as time goes forward, less and less of your code gets transpiled. So it's better for modern browsers. We don't need to transpile back to ES5 for the most part, depending on what your use case is. So start using Babel Preset Em today. That's probably one of the best takeaways, again, from this presentation. So thank you.